Hello and welcome to Queerful. Hello and welcome back to all of the girls and the gays and the theys. Of course, you have stumbled upon Queerful. This is a podcast that explores the many ways that LGBTQ plus folks of all stripes are creating social change, challenging power structures, inverting binaries, and thriving in a hetero-patriarchal world. Put that on a bumper sticker. Each week, I am joined by someone who's following their passions, whatever that may look like, and I invite them to share about their lives, who they are, what they do, and how they got there so that all of us may be inspired and challenged. This week's guest is Melissa Faliveno, who is the author of the debut essay collection TOMBOYLAND, named by NPR, New York Public Library, Oprah Magazine, and Electric Literature as a best book of 2020. Her essays and interviews have appeared in Esquire, Paris Review, Bitch, Miss Magazine, and the Brooklyn Rail, among many others, and received a notable selection in Best American Essays. Born and raised in small-town Wisconsin, she is the 2020-21 Kenan Visiting Writer at UNC Chapel Hill and lives in Brooklyn, New York. Now, I read Tomboyland, which is Melissa Faliveno's debut book. It's an essay collection, and it came out in the summer of 2020. And I read it several months ago, and I fell in love with how much she talks about Wisconsin and how much she talks about being from Wisconsin as a queer person, because I am also from Wisconsin and I am a queer person. I actually currently live in Madison, Wisconsin, if I haven't mentioned that many other times in this podcast and in chatting with folks. Reading through this essay collection, there were so many of what Melissa calls these like treasure crumbs that they left for people who know Madison and people who know Wisconsin to sort of pick up on, which I did, and we talked about it a lot in our interview. So what follows is a really rich interview that you're going to hear Melissa talking about some of the things that the essay collection talks about, which is our relationship to our bodies and our relationship to gender and how that sort of intersects with our relationship to place and land and home. Melissa talks about being from a rural small town community and then moving to the bigger suburban life of Madison and now lives in Brooklyn. And so kind of talks about what it looks like to exist in physical spaces and to exist in your body and sort of like cultural and regional quirks. And it's a really powerful and timely collection that I really loved, and that if you're a fan of this podcast, you will probably also be a fan of Melissa's work. We spent a good chunk of time just talking about Madison because I really wanted to just pick Melissa's brain and ask what their favorite things about Madison are. And so I left all of that in here, and our interview's a little bit longer. This episode might be just a tad longer than some of the past ones, but I wanted to keep it in there for those of you who are listening who are my Madison friends or just folks from Wisconsin. I left that in there for you. And, we name drop some places and name drop some things about Madison and the rural communities surrounding it. And I hope that you will pick up on those. And as Melissa describes this book, it is a love letter to Wisconsin and a love letter to the Midwest. So this episode is especially for my Midwestern queers. Before we jump into the interview with Melissa, we're going to hop on over to a segment called In the Queer and Now and just sort of look at what is going on in queer pop culture and life at the moment. Welcome to In the Queer and Now. This is the part of the show where I get to talk about whatever I want. I mean, that's kind of the whole show because it's a podcast and I'm just creating it in my bedroom. But this part of the show is especially where I just get to share things that I'm excited about, things that are happening in pop culture or society or in the queer community specifically that I want queer folks to know about. So for this week's Queer and Now, the first thing that we have to talk about, obviously, is Lil Nas X's Montero, Call Me By Your Name music video and the song itself, honestly. So if you have not seen this music video, like, I really don't know what you're waiting for. It is well worth your time. And if you haven't seen the music video, you still probably seen the discourse and like controversy that it's caused on the internet, on TV. Like, people are losing their minds. Basically, Lil Nas X like grew up as a queer kid in our society that has so much baggage that comes from sort of the heteronormativity and patriarchy that comes with sort of like Christian culture that's been married with American politics to this weird like Christian nationalism that we really love in this country for some reason. And so, you know, we all know what that's like if you know, if you're from the US. You know, growing up in that environment as a queer kid, you know, you get these messages that being queer is not a good thing and that gay people are going to hell. And so Lil Nas X took this cultural sort of assumption and just turned it into a beautiful piece of art that's like resistance and like introspective, but it's also just so hella fun, you know? Like, the song just is a bop, a straight banger. And as the kids are saying, so yes, I have nothing else to say about it other than the fact that you should just go listen to it. It's so good. And if you've only experienced it secondhand through articles and think pieces, just go watch the video. It's really short. It's like 3 minutes long. And, you know, it's so good. This song is the song of the summer, I feel like. And if clubs were open, if queer bars were able to like safely be packed with people, like, this is what we would all be dancing to this summer. And you know, just thank you to Nas for creating this video, which he had so much of a hand in creating. You can tell, like, he's just a troll. If you follow him on TikTok or Instagram or Twitter, he's just absolutely a troll. And so much of this music video is just him being a troll, but also having amazing artistic expression and trolling at the same time. So that is an accomplishment and a feat. Thank you, sir, for your service. So yes, the first thing on today's In the Queer and Now is you need to go watch Montero and you need to listen to it. Even if it's not your style of music, and even if you don't end up loving the song, like, musically, that's okay, but you just need to experience it once for yourself, and don't just experience it secondhand through some person's like long think piece on Medium, because you need to experience it. And the other thing I wanted to talk about in the Queer Now is this new lawsuit that you may have read about. A lot of news outlets have been running this story for the past couple of weeks since it was announced, but there is this group called the Religious Exemption Accountability Project, and I'm going to link to this in the episode notes on my website. But basically, this is a lawsuit that is challenging discrimination that LGBTQ plus students face at Christian colleges. So there are, I believe, 33 plaintiffs in this case who came together and are representing this cause, and they're suing the Department of Education. And basically, their argument is that religious exemptions for Title IX, which is a statute that protects college students in a lot of ways. It has to do a lot with gender equity. It has to do with like sports and housing, and it covers a lot of things. And I'm not an expert on all of the like super specific legal things, so I'm not going to try to explain intricacies that I don't understand. But I am familiar with the ramifications of Title IX, and this is actually really personal for me as well, because the university that I went to was a private Christian university and actually made national news like several years ago, because it was one of the first two colleges to request this specific religious exemption from Title IX, basically because part of Title IX is equitable housing access for students and different things like that, and sports access. And so religious colleges have an exemption so that they don't have to allow like transgender students to live in housing that corresponds with their gender, and so on and so forth, right? And so these colleges have exemptions because they say, well, what if our religious beliefs, aka transphobia, make it so that we don't want to allow these students to do these things. And so now there are many, many colleges across the country that have religious exemptions to what is, civil rights cases that universities have to abide by. And so this case is basically saying that this is unconstitutional, right? And that like if a private university is gonna be exempt from having to have equitable practices, that they shouldn't receive federal education dollars. So personally, I'm really excited about this, and I think that this is really important. I don't know what's going to happen with the case, but I know that just them speaking up and sharing their stories, and the fact that there's 33 students who represent a bunch of different universities, telling this story and telling the story of how LGBT students are discriminated against and not always safe at some of these universities. It's personally really important to me. And I'm really excited about it. I'm going to link to it in the episode notes, like I said. I encourage you to go check it out. I'm not going to try to go into more detail, and maybe I misexplained some of the legal things about it, because again, I'm not an expert on all of those things. But if you go to their website and look up the Religious Exemption Accountability Project, REAP for short, go look them up and read what they're doing, read about the lawsuit. You can read some of the more specifics about Title IX and how Title IX operates and how the exemptions operate. I want to say thank you to these students for putting their faces out there and putting their names out there and standing up for the many, many, many more students whose names and faces are not attached to this, right? Because there's lots more students who are affected by these things. But these 33 students who have gone public and affiliated with this are really doing a lot to help students everywhere, to help queer students specifically feel safer. So that is what is going on in queer culture and society from my perspective that I wanted to share. Go watch Montero and go check out the Religious Exemption Accountability Project. I will link those things in the episode notes. And now it is time for us to jump in and meet Melissa Faliveno and get into this interview. So let's just jump right into it. All right. Well, welcome, Melissa, to the Queerful podcast. Thank you so much for agreeing to sit down and chat with me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Yay. Something that I've started asking people at the beginning, just to sort of like center the conversation, is what is something that you've been doing over the past year that's brought you joy or rest?
Good question. Important question. Not enough things, I don't think. I feel like I've really, I have a pretty specific reading practice that I kind of think of as part of my writing practice. But I think that this past year has given me a little bit more space to expand that and read more than I had been. And certainly more than I expected to in a year that I put my first book out. I was like, I'm going to be on the road and doing everything. And that didn't happen, obviously. So I was able to kind of maintain a reading practice when like I wasn't able to maintain anything else.
Yeah.
So that has, like always, reading has been very good for me and very centering, and also like keeps me reminded about why I write and keeps me inspired.
Yeah. If you don't mind sharing, what is that reading practice like? Do you read, is it just like fiction reading? Do you have like a combination of like inspiration versus fun?
Yes, I do, but now they're kind of getting muddy because this first book that I wrote that I was working on for 10 years is an essay collection, obviously. And so when I was working kind of in work mode, um, I would read essays for like sort of work inspiration, or turn to an essay collection, like flip open, to a random page to one of my favorite essay collections or something that I was obsessed with at the time. And that would really get me motivated to work. And then I read novels for fun. But now I'm working on a novel, which is a surprise for me. I didn't expect to be doing that. So now I'm reading predominantly novels, but it's both for pleasure and for work. So I'm still like enjoying the process, but I'm taking note of things in a way that I don't think I was specifically before. Like I was taking it all in when I would read it previously, but now I'm like pointing to craft things. I'm like, oh, like, look at what they did here, or, oh yeah, this would be an interesting thing to do, or like how they're developing a character or whatever. So that line has gotten blurred. But I read every day. I always read in the morning. That's like my daily practice. So first thing when I get up in the morning, I make coffee, and then like with my first and second cup, usually I read, and usually that lasts at least an hour, and then I go about my day, and then generally I'll read at night too, but that doesn't last as long because I fall asleep.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Yeah, no, that's always something I wonder, especially with fiction writers, because I write some nonfiction stuff, and that's always been most of my, like, I guess pleasure reading is like reading a lot of sociology and like that kind of stuff that falls in my realm. And so it would be, interesting to be reading novels, which is like an enjoyable process, but also being able to like take notice of the craft, like you said.
Yeah, watching movies and TV has become that too. Like I still watch them for enjoyment, or like, just like to zone out. But if I'm watching something good, I'm like
right,
also paying attention to the craft of that kind of storytelling and how it takes shape and images and scenes and stuff like that.
Yeah. Cool. Well, so I want to talk a little bit about this book that you put out, Tomboyland. I don't actually remember the first recommendation or how it ended up on my list, because I have a ginormous list of books that I want to read.
Yes.
But it was probably from a local recommendation, just because I know that you do write about being from Wisconsin, and I've lived in Wisconsin for most of my life. I went to undergrad in Michigan, but I'm never really left the Midwest in a permanent way.
Yes.
So just like reading the book for me was so fun, because I love essays and like that sort of form of writing, but also just like there would be little places or things you would mention, even like the roller derby league, which like I have friends who are in that now, like living in Madison, or like Mickey's Tavern, like all these like places that for a lot of people are probably just like parts of the story. But for me, I'm like, oh, I've been there. This is so fun to like read someone else's experience of a place that I've like been to recently.
Yes, I love that. I sort of felt like I think of this book in many ways as like a love letter to Wisconsin and the Midwest, and it's been called that before too. And um, I think sometimes in particular it's a love letter to Madison. And when I was writing those scenes, and some of which were like interviews with friends in that took place in Madison, I felt like I was dropping little treasure nuggets for my community there. I still have so many friends and family, both biological and chosen, who live in Madison in the area. And I'm going to throw this in and, see who picks it up, and, who recognizes what. And it felt like leaving little, treasure crumbs.
Yeah, no, it was that for me, definitely, it's really beautiful, and just like a love letter, like you said. Which one of my questions I was going to ask, which I'll jump to that because that sort of reminded me of it, is have you encountered, I know that you've lived in New York, and just sort of like in other places beyond the Midwest, any misconceptions about Wisconsin, or maybe upper Midwest more generally, um, especially for queer folks, because I think there's sort of this narrative that it's like backwards, or like, you know, it's not the South, but it's very like heteronormative, family oriented. And to see your book and to read these stories coming from like a queer person who's like, but I love Wisconsin, you know, it's very sort of written in a positive tone, and there are negative stories as well. So I'm just wondering if you could share about that, if that's like shocked anybody, or if you've had any response to that sort of like the tone that you talk about it.
Yeah, I think, I think one of the interesting things that's happened is, um, among many, is that like I've had people say, oh, I actually had a person say something, and this isn't verbatim, but like, I didn't know that there were queer people in the Midwest. And it was not like I didn't literally believe that there were any queer people in the Midwest. It was more like I just assumed that everyone leaves.
Right.
And that turned into a really interesting conversation because I was like, no, no, not everyone leaves. And then I was like, well, I left. But I also, kind of like I really long for home, and I think about going back all the time. And I know that I hope that eventually I'm going to end up in the Midwest again. And it's interesting to think about that idea that like of the Midwest as being a place where one escapes, especially if one is not among the sort of like heteronormative masses. But that like there are actually such vibrant queer communities in a lot of places in the Midwest, and not just the cities, and like in the rural parts, but specifically, more so in cities. And so I guess I've had some good conversations in that regard. And I've also had the responses that are like, ugh, I could never live there, or like, I could never go back to a place like that. People who have left the Midwest. And I find that really interesting because I don't feel that way, like even though I've had experiences there that have not been awesome, I've had so many great ones too. And I've had so many experiences that weren't awesome in New York or, anywhere else.
Right.
And it's really about the community that you find and carve out for yourself. And that can be anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it. Thank you. I like that idea of how most people think of it as a place to escape, or like even just the idea of like rural communities or small towns, that like so much of the queer coming of age like trope is that you get away. And for some people that's necessary, and sometimes people come away and then they come back. But I thought it was just kind of like a different take that sort of focused on how many things there are to love about where you come from, and how that can coexist with sort of the bad experiences, and yes. I really appreciate that take, because that's been my experience too. And like there are things about my hometown that I don't love and that certainly maybe have room to grow in terms of being inclusive and things like that. But like you said, it's not like there's not those issues in New York too,
Yeah. And I love that you said that about, that observation that it's about both, because it really is. I mean, you can describe this book as a love letter to the Midwest, but it's a love letter that includes, the complexities of love. And sometimes those complexities, it means looking at the things that aren't great and aren't perfect and need work. And like, maybe that's what love is, constantly trying to make yourself better. And like, and I think about that a lot, and especially in terms of my hometown, which, Madison I think of as my second hometown, but my actual hometown, Mount Horeb, where I grew up and lived until I was 18. I think about that, like, if you had asked me 10 years ago, 15, certainly 20, if I would ever move back to a town like Mount Horeb, like a town of a couple thousand, I would have said, no way. Like, there's no absolutely no chance. And I still don't think that I would thrive in a town that small. I really need access to like people and stuff and live music and art and things like
Right.
that. Assuming we can all get back to that space eventually.
Yeah.
Um, but the growth that I've seen, like since I lived there, I left in 2001, and have not lived there since then, has been really extraordinary. Like a few years ago, they made national news because the public library hosted a reading of I Am Jazz for I Am Jazz and like a book club discussion. Like so many people came out after Westboro Baptist Church had like protested it. And that I was like, I've never been prouder of my hometown. Like, I know people were in the town were probably protesting it too, but the fact that such a huge population turned out and we're on the right side of that battle, um, I was floored and really proud. And then like I was talking to a friend in Madison who she and her wife have lived in Madison for a long time and they have a kid and they were talking about moving out to Mount Horeb. And I was like, why? Because they've got a great house in Madison and they just seem to have a great life there. And my friend was like, well, they have, such a great school district. And the Gay Straight Alliance is really great there. And I was like, whoa, what? in Mount Horeb School District? And she was like, yeah, it's like recognized like in the area. And that floored me. And then when I was kind of touring, doing my virtual tour for this book, I got invited to do a talk at the Mount Horeb chapter of PFLAG, which also didn't exist when I was there. So I don't know, that kind of stuff. And like a bunch of people turned out, former teachers that I've had, like neighbors, my parents. That was really neat. And it's just like, I think it's really easy sometimes to like look at our country and look at the world and like get stuck in that sort of destructive thought pattern of like, we're making no progress, because things always vacillate and terrible stuff is always happening. But like when you can actually see beats of like tangible progress, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I wonder too, and this is maybe a half-baked thought, but I always wonder if folks who come from, well, maybe I'll say this in the opposite, but people who come from really progressive families or who come from really progressive cities or big cities, and who grew up as queer, I feel like sometimes have a different perspective from people who maybe grew up in smaller rural communities or in just like in red states, or not to say one experience is more meaningful than the other, but just that sometimes when you have to maybe fight for your identity a little bit more, or maybe go through different sets of challenges when it comes to like naming who you are and figuring that out. So I feel like, just my peers looking at where I come from, like I think went through different challenges than other people. And again, that's not to rank challenges, but I just think that that's a story that gets forgotten when the narrative is just kind of like, well, if you're queer, you're going to be happiest if you live in New York or LA, because that's not necessarily the case for everybody. And some people still want to, you can be a queer person and like living in the woods.
Oh yeah, which is like my happiest place.
Yeah.
Like I'm in the woods right now and I love it. And it's like I mean I think I'm actually more kind of myself and happiest when I'm in a more rural space and a wooded space, and I have a lot of access to the outdoors and nature, and I love a city. And if I ever, permanently leave Brooklyn, I'm sure I'll miss it. But I think that I just come alive in a different way when I'm in the woods. Like when I was finishing Tomboyland, I went to the woods of Wisconsin for 6 weeks, way up north, like the border of Wisconsin, the UP. And my family has a cabin up there. And I was just alone in the woods for 6 weeks, and it was amazing. And like my butchest self came out. And I just felt so good. I was like, this is it. This is where I'm meant to be. So yeah, but yeah, it's all a journey, and like uh, we have to find the places where we feel most ourselves, I think. And sometimes it's surprising. I don't know. And maybe sometimes it means like leaving and going to a really huge city to figure out, like, okay, this is the part of this I want. This is what I need. And this is maybe what I don't need, and be able to kind of like more clearly define what you want and where you want to be as you go along.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that sentiment so much. I used to talk with friends about how, queer people are everywhere is something that I like to say. And that's kind of a little bit the inspiration of this podcast. Is I'm intentionally trying to like reach out to people who work in different fields or who come from different places, just because I really want to fight back against the narrative that there's like one monolithic way to be queer. And I think
Yeah.
we've come a long way in that from 20 years ago culturally.
Yeah.
But it's important to me that like progress is not seen as one specific path, but progress is like having options and having
Mm,
possibilities that you can, like you said, like find where you're most comfortable and being able to go where that is, and making sure that that space is safe, whether that's a big city or that's a rural community, like making sure that any of those spaces are safe, because you should be able to be in any of those spaces.
yeah.
um
Yeah.
and I think there's a ways to go, but it is so heartwarming and just like makes me proud to see the progress, like you said, like Mount Horeb having a renowned GSA, like that's amazing. And
Yeah.
my I didn't grow up, I grew up in Janesville, which is much more suburban.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I have family in that area too. My grandparents both worked there for years.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's very suburban, but I um had friends from the surrounding schools who would come to Janesville, was the place to come to shop or whatever.
Yep.
And I worked in Beloit for a while when I moved back to Wisconsin, and they have a queer organization down there now, and they had their first like Pride Fest in, I think it was like 2017 or 18, like a couple of years ago, and it was like this big thing, and they had people come down from Madison to like perform, and it was just like, it was this just amazing to see, and it was all like organized by like people from Rock County, and I was like,
Oh, I love that.
yeah, it was just so great. And for me, that I had more fun there than I did at like Chicago Pride, because like Chicago Pride is fun, but like to see these like high schoolers and junior hires who like helped put together this event where they know that this is like the first ever of its kind, and like that this is like a really groundbreaking moment, and to see like people be part of that, like I don't know, it meant something more and something different to me than
Yeah.
driving to Chicago or something, or the Twin
Yeah.
Cities to go to Pride.
Yeah, and especially in a place that is so like historically, I mean, I don't know. I didn't live in Rock County, but I do have a lot of family there. And like I had a actually weirdly, I had a friend in grad school at Sarah Lawrence in New York who's from Cape Town, South Africa. She's a queer dancer and she went to college in Beloit. And like I remember talking to her about it and I was like, what? I had the same conversation with her. I was like, what did you do in Beloit?
Yeah.
I remember playing ice hockey there when I was a kid and like I mean, not that I was looking at the time, but I don't remember seeing queer people anywhere. And she was like, no, we mostly went to Chicago.
Yeah.
And then she moved to Chicago and lived in Chicago, but like she'd be so happy to know that.
Yeah. And yeah, it's cool just seeing little pockets that, just because you're not in an area that's known for being queer. Like my hometown's claim to fame is that we birthed Paul Ryan. Like that's what we're known for. So uh but
Oh God, gross.
that doesn't mean like there aren't queer people doing things, in those
Right,
spaces. So it's,
right.
yeah, it's fun.
That's awesome. Man, such good news.
Yeah. So talking about Wisconsin too, this is just a fun thing that I wanted to ask you about. Are there things about Madison in particular? I know that you talked about it being sort of your second home. Um, when people think of Wisconsin, I guess I don't know, but I imagine when other people think of Wisconsin, they do think more of like the small towns and stuff. But my experience of Madison is that Madison is very queer and very like hipster arts community. Like you
Mhm.
wrote about like the kink community here, and like there's so much of all of those things that
Mhm.
counters that narrative. But I was just wondering if you have any like favorite things or how you would describe sort of the characters of Madison and your favorite things about it.
Ooh. Well, okay, so I've been gone from Madison for like impossibly 12 years now. So I know that a ton of things have changed. And a lot of the things that I loved are probably gone. But when I think of Madison and like so I was there for about 8 years because I went to college at UW and then I stayed for a few years afterward and worked and played derby mostly. um, when I think of those years, I think primarily of those years after college, and it was like, my early to mid 20s. And it was just like such a magical confluence for me of meeting the right people at the right time. And and roller derby did that for me. Like roller derby gave me the community that I never had. I had good friends in college, but I very few of them were queer. Um, and and I didn't really feel like wholly seen because I don't think I was fully seeing myself at that time. I know I wasn't. I had an ally sticker on my backpack. But I I think when I think of Madison, I think of those years and I think of roller derby and I think of like showing up to the first day of tryouts and looking around the room, and the room was Fast Forward Skate Center, where I had grown up roller skating as a kid, and like looking around the room and seeing all these people that kind of looked like me, that like had, similar sort of like fashion aesthetics, but all like who were like clearly queer and but who were also just like very cool and I was just like, holy shit. Like, what did I find? Um and it was just like a homecoming, and like and we spent like 3 to 4 years together, just doing kind of everything together. And they weren't perfect years. There's a lot of like hard stuff that went on too, as happens for most people in their early to mid 20s. But like, I think about going to practice on a Sunday morning and then going out to get brunch, usually at Mickey's afterward. Or there was a place, oh man, it's not there anymore. It was a Greek place that made the best egg sandwiches, like right by where the Cardinal Bar either was or used to be. Is the Cardinal still there?
I not to
I,
my I don't know it, but
I think the Cardinal closed. The Cardinal was like a queer epicenter. Like they had dance parties all the time, and there was like, I don't know, we hung out there a lot and went to their dance parties. But just like moving around in a community and like hanging out at each other's houses in a town where you can bike to one another's houses or sometimes walk across the street to your
right.
friend's house. Um, it was Madison to me are those years and those places and those people, and like there's so much more of Madison that I don't know about, but it's like this it's mostly like Willie Street into Atwood Avenue and that neighborhood. That's where I lived in those years. And like all the restaurants and bars and clubs we went to, and roller skating mostly at Fast Forward, which is still there. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
oh, also getting drinks at La Tigra. I don't know if La Tigra is still there.
Yes, actually.
Okay, that place is wild. I love that place.
Yeah, no, I when I first met my partner, they lived on Willie Street, and that was when I first moved up here. I grew up in Janesville, and then I went to college in Michigan, and I was there for 4 years, and then I moved back. And I was home for like a year or so before I moved up here. So, um, it's kind of cool like coming back as an adult and experiencing it, because like living in Janesville, there are things to do in Janesville, but we would still drive up to Madison, because there's more to do in Madison. But experiencing it now, like as an adult, where I actually like live here and actually spend more time downtown, it's to me, it's my parents would probably not agree with this, and like people that I know wouldn't agree with this, but to me, Madison is very much Wisconsin. Like it's just like a glorified small town. Like even though there's so many people that live here, like it just feels like a big neighborhood. Like everything is close and everything feels friendly.
Yeah, that's true. It is. It's like a big small town. Totally is.
Yeah.
And I think especially after living in New York for so long, like I always thought that smallness would feel a little claustrophobic, but every time I go back, I'm like, oh yeah, I love this. It's like, it's a great size. It's like, it's big enough, that there are actually a lot of people around, but that it does have that like community vibe to it.
Yeah, it's a good size. Like it's big enough that if you're an artist or something, like there are venues, or that if you're, there's things to do, but it's not so big that you get lost in it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I know a lot of businesses change or move or shut down, but the Willie Street area, a lot of it's not probably the same businesses, although Mickey's is still there.
Yes.
But I feel like the spirit of it is still there.
Yeah, totally. When I was living there, I actually worked in for a small press that was based in the house on Willie Street that is now, I believe, a ramen restaurant.
Yes.
So that used to be our office, and I like worked in there for 2 years. And lived on Spate Street, so I was just like always in that area and walking around, and not much of what was there in that stretch when I was there is present anymore. It's all new stuff, but it does feel like the spirit is still there.
Yeah. So shifting a little bit, I wanted to talk about the book and your process of writing it. I know that you mentioned that it was sort of like something that you'd been sitting on for a long time. Like I know that these are probably they're stories about your life, so I'm sure that you had carried them with you for a long time. But I was wondering what was sort of the impetus for you to say, like, I'm going to collect these stories and like as an essay collection. And what was that process like? Because I imagine it was cathartic, but maybe challenging because some of it is very personal. So I was just wondering what that was like for you.
Yeah. So I kind of not always, but I think I knew I wanted to write essays starting in college when I took my first creative nonfiction class. And so I was writing essays, but I didn't really have any designs on a book at the time. When I was living in Madison, I wrote for Isthmus, so I was writing these. They were all like feature stories about other people, but also included myself. I was the sort of the first person narrator talking about community. So I wrote about the kink community, I wrote about roller derby, things like that. And I really loved that. I loved like marrying kind of cultural reportage and interview with personal narrative. And that's really what I feel like I still love to do most, and really what a lot of these essays are doing in the book. And when I left Madison in 2009, I moved to New York to do my MFA at Sarah Lawrence. And like ever since making that decision, I knew I wanted to write an essay collection. It just was a goal that had crystallized, and I knew that that's what I wanted to do. So going to grad school was really a way to jumpstart that in a really focused way. So some of the oldest essays in this book I first wrote in my graduate program. And then afterward, I just sort of like kept writing and trying to submit my essays to journals, and got a few little publications here and there, but a lot of rejection, and eventually had a stack of essays. And I didn't, I knew that I was writing a book about the Midwest, and that's all I knew. I knew that most of the essays that I wrote were about Wisconsin, leaving Wisconsin, something about that. So I tried to like submit them as a book a couple times, and they promptly got rejected because it was just like, okay, essays about the Midwest, what does that mean? And who are you? And basically, like, I had a shift after the 2016 election, and I started writing more specifically about gender and like living in my body, and about gun violence, and about things that were just like on my mind, on so many people's mind, that were sort of thrust to the fore of conversation in a way that was both rage inducing and I think like invigorating to me. So I started like really kind of writing about stuff that I had never written about before. And I realized that looking back on this body of work I had completed in the previous few years was like all circling around questions having to do with the body and violence and all of the attendant things. And it was like, okay, so I'm writing about the Midwest, but I'm also writing about the body, and I'm writing about land, and I'm writing about the body's connection to the land it comes from, and the people it comes from. And I'm writing about identity, and so as I started like kind of swirling around those things, the kind of like centers of gravity of the book started really making themselves known. I was like, I got an agent, my literary agent was like looking at all my essays, and she was like, in order to try to sell these, we have to have sort of an organizing theme that everything is kind of circling around. And I was like, what do you think that is? And she was like, I think you're writing about gender, in a lot of different ways. And I was like, okay, I think you're right. So that's how we kind of put together a pitch for the book. And then when we sold it to a publisher, then I had the work of like finishing these essays that I had started working on and writing a couple new ones, and they all had to sort of fit under that umbrella. And they can be tangentially related, like there's an essay in the book of a moth that is very much, I think, about like loneliness and isolation, but it's also about a body existing in loneliness and isolation and finding connection with another person. And so, yeah, it's about gender kind of in that like the ways we express our gender sometimes is like, a physical sort of manifestation, and about connection and who we're connected to and what we're connected to, and how we exist alone and how we exist together, I guess. So anyway, that's kind of how it came together. And it made a lot of sense because I had been struggling for a long time against like all of these kind of disparate threads, and I think I felt like they were working against each other. Like I thought I was writing about class, and then I was like, well, I guess maybe I'm not writing about class. And then I was like, wait, like everything is intersectional, like
Right.
the way I experience gender is like very connected to this sort of like working class environment that I grew up in, and how we look and what we do and what we work, what we do for work, and my family origins, what they did for work, and stuff like that. So that was really liberating, like to think of it, and really exciting to think of it in terms of like the intersections between place and class and gender and sexuality, and like all of these things that inform and complicate one another. So that's the long story.
Yeah.
How the book came to me.
Yeah. No, and I think that like I can imagine that it would have been difficult to like try to find one organizing principle because it is all of those things, but that's what I really loved about it. I think that like when I picked it up, I had like the presupposition. I was like, oh, this is about like gender, like Tomboyland. Like my first instinct was that. But then like reading how much you do talk about like land and place and how those things like are so connected and they inform each other, that was really cool to see. And I've just been spending a lot of time this past year like thinking about the concept of bodies and like our relationships to our bodies. And something that you wrote about that I had a question here was about like the way you talk about gender. And correct me if I'm misinterpreting, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but it's like that gender is really just sort of the language that we're using to describe like a physical experience, or like when we're experiencing our bodies. And that's not to say that gender is not important, but like when I was reflecting on it, and this week I was reread the Tomboy chapter and was just like thinking about how I feel like we're at a weird crossroad in the queer community, like at this point in culture, because we have all of these words to describe sort of our experiences, and that's great. And in a lot of ways that's progress. But sometimes I feel like where we're at right now is sort of transitional. Like it's not a stopping place, because where, I log on to Facebook or worse yet, Reddit or Tumblr or something, and there's like heated discussions about whether you should call yourself bisexual or pansexual, or whether like non-binary people can use this abbreviation. Like there's just, and those discussions are good and important, like ways of working out language that we're sort of making up as we go. But yes. I don't know, I've just been spending time thinking about like where are we going to be at in 10 years, and I hope that like, I don't know, language is a tool, and language is not the end goal. So I was wondering if you where was my actual question, if you could just expand on that idea and like what you see the role of like language, and specifically like identity words, when it comes to gender and bodies. Like what do you see as the role of that kind of thing?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's so complicated, not least because, like you said, we're creating it, we're making it up as we go. And that's what language is. Language is an invention, and like we're giving words to things, and in doing so giving meaning to things. And it's an impossible task to like give a meaning to an experience of one's body, and like put that into a word. But we keep trying because we have to, because that's what we do as humans. Like we make meaning out of experience. That's what writing is. We're making meaning out of experience, and we're learning and we're growing and we're evolving and we're constantly changing and hopefully progressing. Not to say that there isn't a lot of regression that happens in the process. I think language is super important. And I think that it's, like you said, it's great that we have so many words, because gender is, to me, such a fluid thing. And it is, like you said, it's a trend. We're in a transitional phase, but like gender is like this constantly shifting, evolving experience for a lot of people. Like not for everybody, but like for a lot of us, it's always shifting. And so you can give yourself a label and a name that feels right one day, and then the next day you're like, ooh, is this it? And so I think it's super important because it's giving language for experiences that we didn't have language before in the past. But as we create each definition, we're expanding more and more. So hopefully the process continues to expand. We have to keep creating new language for, newly articulated experiences. And I don't think that's ever going to be like, it's a challenging and sometimes frustrating thing to be like find yourself at the center of the bisexual pansexual debate, for instance, and be like, well, I always just say bisexual because it's what I like best. And also because I know that it can contain multitudes. It doesn't need to be binary,
Right.
and for me it's not. Um, but like then you're like, well, but by saying it, am I implying a binary, and am I perpetuating a binary because this word has bi in it,
Right.
and then it's like a spiral. You're like, how am I being interpreted? How am I being understood? And that's like what identity is all about too. Like you make meaning for yourself, but you're a human is constantly being interpreted and perceived in the world, and like we can't control how we're interpreted and perceived in the world. We know how we would like to be usually, but and Tomboy, that essay is so much about that. um and so and that essay too, I think, is about like I remember like some tagline, I don't remember where it was, but it was like finding the language that fits, something like that. And I was like, well, it's not really about finding the language that fits. It's about finding the language that like feels right in the moment. And there's this problem where people who are not queer, or who, are trying to understand queer identity, are like, I just want to know, I just want a definition. I want to know that you're in this category. I just want to know. Like, people have said that and say that over and over again. Like, oh, well, just, it's good that you've got all these letters in the acronym, but like, I just want to know.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, dude, I just want to know too, but it doesn't work like that, like we don't always know. And I think that if we're doing this human thing right, like not knowing is exciting and is okay, and is actually like where the exploration and the progress happens, and like delving into that unknowing and being okay with not having exactly the right word or box to fit in, or definition or whatever. And just accepting that like this might change and we might change, not individually, collectively. So that was kind of a rant, but
No, yeah. No, that makes sense to me. A lot of sense. Like you said, finding the language to describe your experience with yourself and with the world in any given moment. Like, I feel like that should be, rather than finding something to just like sit in and like permanently land somewhere, just like sitting in, I mean, like it's an evolving process. Like I don't feel like there's an end point, and I don't know if as society as a whole we're quite ready for this, but like part of like all the like LGBTQ plus identity language is an outpouring of re-examining at the basic level, like what does it mean to be a man and what does it mean to be a woman? Like that's sort of the starting point. And I feel like there's still some more room to unpack that as a society, because I mean, like I see debate, like, I don't remember if it was a Pew Research number, but there was, a number that was like a survey that like 10% of Americans identify as some sort of LGBTQ, and then it was like 20% of people under 25 or something, these numbers. And then you have some people being like, that makes total sense. And you have other people being like, no, that can't be true. There's can't be that many queer people. Right. And, I think like eventually we'll get to a place where that won't even matter, because like even as someone who identifies as a cisgender man or a cisgender woman, even within that experience, that doesn't actually tell you very much about them. Like that doesn't actually tell you what their experience is of themselves or how they walk through the world. You can have two people who are women and identify as women and were assigned woman at birth, but like their experiences of their bodies are so different from person to person. And I think I see this in the queer community, and I think it's just a natural, like we just want structure. Our brains just like structure and categorization. I like my most recent not pet peeve, but just when thinking about this, I've thought about it a lot, because like I use the word non-binary for myself just because it's, I see it as kind of an umbrella term of just kind of like
Mhm.
not fitting into one or the other. But I've noticed that like as that term gains more sort of like mainstream understanding, like you have people like Sam Smith or Miley Cyrus like using these words, and so more straight people are like, oh, I know what this means. So now like I see people like talking about how, okay, there's men, and men use he him pronouns, and there's women, and women use she her pronouns, and then there's non-binary people who use they them
Yeah.
pronouns, and it's just like a third gender basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
rather than like deconstructing the whole concept. So,
Yes. Yeah. But I mean, that's totally right. That like we I think as a species just want structure, and uh we've lived for our whole existence as as humans with like creating structures for our experiences in the world, and like those structures are how we think we understand things. And so the idea of deconstructing those long held and perpetuated structures is threatening for so many people, because they're like, well, what does that mean about me or my existence? And as frustrating as that is, I deal with it all the time with people I'm close to, like wanting that, they don't understand it. So they just like want to know, and they want to know what you are, and like, what words you use. And like, it's wildly frustrating and sometimes maddening, but like, I get where it comes from, especially if it's not your experience. You're like, well, what does that mean exactly?
mhm.
I think it's like almost inherent in our beings to like try to, you know, look at like the computers of our brain are like making all the calculations, or like, okay, you're that, and you're that. And it's like so hard to dismantle that when it's
Yeah,
so ingrained, but liberating too, I think.
yeah, yeah. I liked what you said before about being able to sort of sit in the unknowing. Like I think that's the way forward. Like I don't remember word for word what it was, but I liked how you wrote about like your relationship to the word woman, or how like there can be times where like this is a word that can mean different things based on context, and like, or talked about being misgendered. And I have that experience too, where like when you're being called bro or dude can mean different
Mhm.
things based on who's saying it and what the context is and how you feel about yourself on any given day. And
Yeah.
like, and that's obviously different from person to person. But like, I feel like we still have this discomfort to just say, I don't know, or to say like, I'm not sure what my relationship
Yeah.
to these words are. And I don't know, but I really, really like that framing of just being able to say, I don't know yet, or,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's kind of like the I mean, it's a daily challenge for sure. And that like that relationship to the word woman, I think, is one that I return to a lot, because and this comes up in the book all the time, but that this like conflicted feeling of both wanting to be a part of the societal, historical, and cultural implications of the word and feeling a part of it, and then also at the exact same time, or by the next turn, feeling totally alienated from it and outside of it and not a part of it, and like wanting to not be a part of it. And for me, all of the feminized words and labels I have a relationship with, except for the ones that I just like hate, like ladies. If someone calls me lady, or like I'm in a group of women, they're like, hey ladies, I just like want to just punch everything. So there are some things that I know I hate, but like for the most part, it's like, you know, just kind of identifying those inconsistencies and those contradictions and being okay with that. Like, okay, yeah, womanhood doesn't have to mean one thing. And like some days I, will like feel very connected to she, her, and then other times I'll be like, I don't feel anything about that. And then sometimes I'll feel sort of like a, discomfort with it.
Yeah.
So it's just, I don't know. It's all that's always there for me, and maybe it always will be. And for me, I mean, honestly, it goes back to like this is not a new observation in any way, but that's why the word queer has always meant, I've always used as this like overarching umbrella, like, because it just means something else, like if we go back to the origins of the word, just like a little weird, like
Yeah.
something not of the mainstream or of the ordinary. And I love that. Like, I've never been that.
Hmm.
Um, and it can encompass a lot of things, and it can be changing, and it is changing, and allows for that movement and evolution, um, both in terms of sexuality and gender identity. So it's the best we got, I think, at least
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I've always loved the word queer, and obviously there are, there it has a long history. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, because it kind of refuses that attempt to put a specific pin in it. Like you can't mark queer in one specific place or one specific
Yeah.
experience. It's all about just examining what you believe to be normative, and just like all about saying like I'm not that. I don't have to tell you exactly what I am. I
Yes.
I don't have to define every single bit of it, but I just know that I'm not yeah, I guess normative, which I don't know if that's the word I want to use, but
I got you. I got you.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, too, like that it's worth noting. And I think I wrote this in the book too, that like it's not like every single day I'm super comfortable with the word queer either. Like, I think there's an assumption that if we use the word queer, that we are like fully embracing it all the time. And that's not true of my experience either. There are times that I say that and that doesn't feel right. And like, and I think the important work for me is to interrogate, like, is the discomfort I'm feeling like this old sort of learned discomfort with that's still associated with this word for a lot of people in my life? Um, or is it that, like, just like all these other words, I feel like is not doing enough yet, or is
Right.
not encompassing me fully, or whatever, like where does that, sitting in the discomfort again and like paying attention to what it is about that word that's like having an impact on your body somewhere. Like,
Hmm.
why am I feeling this way when I say this, and I don't know. I never have any answers, but it's all about the question.
It's all about asking the right questions.
Ugh.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I've been thinking about that a lot. That was probably my favorite essay, or one of my favorite essays, just the being able to reflect on the words that we use, and the relationship to bodies is I just super fascinating. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a hard one to read, to write, but it seems like it's resonating for a lot of people. So
Yeah.
I'm glad it did.
Well, just have a couple more things. One, I just wanted to ask, obviously, you've probably answered this a million times about like what it's like to write a book during the pandemic, so I won't ask you that verbatim.
Okay.
But I'm just wondering what's next for you. I know right now we're all still living in this sort of waiting for vaccines and waiting for life to shift a little bit back towards what we
Yeah.
used to know. Um, but I'm just wondering what's next for you. You talked about writing a novel.
Yeah, I'm working on a novel, which is a surprise, and I'm hoping to finish that up soon, and hopefully publish it. And then I have a couple ideas for another essay collection slash maybe a book length essay, which is a form I'm really into. I don't know if you've read "Time is a Thing a Body Moves Through" by T. Clutch Fleischman. Oh my God, you have to check that out.
I will write a note.
Oh, it's so good. So it's a book length essay, and it's all about kind of the experience of gender in the body, but also art. And like it's brilliant, oof, it's great. Um, but so I'm interested in that form, like the long form dive into one kind of subject. I'm still writing about class, and I think I might have a piece or maybe a book in the works about work and class, sort of the idea of kind of moving through spaces of class and what we mean by the word class, and um, So anyway, I've got a bunch of ideas in the hopper, but it's just I've gotta pull them together.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that is all I have for you. Do you have any parting words about where people can find you? Or
Yeah, people can find me on the internet. My website is www.melissafaliveno.com. You can also find me, regrettably, very active on Twitter at Melissa Faliveno, and I'm on Instagram at ML Faliveno. And yeah, that's it. I mean, hopefully someday you'll be able to see me in the real world too. I still have hopes that at the year mark of my book's release, which will be August 4th of this year, I'll be able to come back to Madison and do the book launch I never had at Room of One's Own's new location at Wood Avenue. Because I had this whole launch party planned that was in the works last year there. So I've still got hopes for that. So
yes,
stay tuned.
Yes, I hope that you are able to, and I will definitely be there if I can.
Yay. Okay.
Awesome. Well, it was so great meeting you. Thank you for talking. I loved the book, and I loved hearing more of your thoughts, and very excited to see what you come up with in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a very real pleasure.
And that is all that we have for you today. Thank you so much for listening. Again, a huge thanks to Melissa for being on the podcast, for sharing about the book, and for sharing about what's coming up next. I'm super excited to read this novel. Super excited to see what that is about. And also a huge thank you for just like chatting about Wisconsin and Madison with me. I feel like that's what we spent half the time doing, but you know, I enjoyed it. Hopefully y'all enjoyed it too. If you made it to the end here, I'm hoping that means that you liked it, that you stuck it out. Thank you so much for being a listener of this podcast. If you want to find me on the internet and support what I'm doing, you can find me everywhere as Mix Benjamin Rose. That's MX Benjamin Rose. Follow me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, wherever you follow people. I'm probably on those platforms. You can find my website at mixbenjaminrose.com. If you go to mixbenjaminrose.com/podcast, you will be able to find episode notes for this and all the other episodes of Queerful, where you can find the link to listen, and you can also see links to any of the things that we talked about in this episode, or any of the things that I talked about in the Queer Now segment. So make sure you go check out the website, check out all the links and things like that. If you want to follow Melissa and keep up with what Melissa's doing, you can find them, like they said, on Instagram and Twitter, and at their website at melissafaliveno.com. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you like or subscribe or follow or leave a rating, whatever is applicable on the platform you're listening on. Just helps this podcast reach more people and potentially welcome more people into the Queerful family. I appreciate you, and I will see you next time for the next episode of Queerful. Until then, take care of yourselves, get vaccinated if you can, keep wearing a mask, keep being safe, drink some water, and take care of yourself. Okay, love you, bye!